Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Butcher, the Embezzler, and the Fall Guy, a family memoir of scandal and greed in the meat industry, by Gretchen Cherington, narrated by Linda Jones. What is history but a fable agreed upon? Napoleon. Everywhere the land is not ours. Everywhere the past has a dark underbelly. Everywhere what appears to be one thing is something else. Angela Palm. Author's Note. This is a work of memory, research, and my imagination. I am indebted to the Richard Eberhart Literary Estate for permission to use its source materials at Dartmouth College's Rauner Special Collections Library, which include my grandfather A.L. Eberhart's personal letters and business documents. Without those, I would not have found his voice for this book. At Dartmouth, I was assisted by former staff member Sarah Hartwell and current librarian J. Satterfield. My Eberhart cousins have shared family letters, journals, photograph albums, and stories about our grandparents whom none of us knew. Each was a source of vital information, history, and opinion. Memory is fallible and subject to interpretation. Even in primary sources, some facts of this story conflict. Sometimes I have chosen to acknowledge this. Sometimes I have chosen the fact I feel best matches what I have come to believe is true. Where quoting primary sources, I have used italics, and, where needed, edited lightly for ease of reading. I have used a single letter to identify certain persons to protect their privacy. The original research for this book took place during 3 trips to Austin, Minnesota between 1995 and 2000, and 5 years thereafter. Between 2018 and 2022, I expanded the research with generous assistance from individuals in Austin and elsewhere. Any errors are mine alone. George A. Hormel and Company, now often thought of as Hormel Foods, prefers to be referred to by its original name. Where possible in the narrative flow, I have honored that preference. At other times, I've referred to the company simply as Hormel, or the Hormel Company, as it was not known as Hormel Foods at the time of this story. This work is neither intended to be a definitive biography of any of the 3 protagonists, nor a complete history of the first 20 years of George A. Hormel and Company. It is impossible to know the exact truth of events that occurred 100 years ago, or their full impact through the generations that have followed. 1. Flimsy Pretext. Austin, Minnesota, 1922. In late January 1922, Alpha LaRue Eberhart peered out the multi-paned windows of George Hormel's executive office in Austin, Minnesota, at the Red Cedar River below. The river was frozen stiff as death, splitting the meatpacking town in 2. The afternoon temperature had barely risen since daybreak. A biting wind drove across the plains, blowing clouds of snow and factory steam eastward and rattling the window's glass. I imagine A.L., as my grandfather was called, stood his ground, undaunted, eyes sure, as he was forced to resign from the company he had spent 20 years helping to build. The men's words were brief that day. A.L. knew there was no point in arguing with his high-strung boss. George Albert Hormel was unlikely to change his mind. Maybe that day, as in photographs, George's right hand palmed his thigh, his finger spreading south, as if ordering a dog to sit. George's skin was paler than A.L.'s, his hair thicker and parted left to right, his nose nearly piercing his upper lip. His pinched eyes nipped the skin behind his wire-rimmed glasses, conjuring a scolding teacher dressing down an errant student. When the ticking clock on his wall struck the next hour, packing-house workers would hang up their aprons and head home. Despite the bespoke suits and starched shirt collars worn by these men, theirs was a killing business, an abattoir that turned plump animals into food, splattering blood on the meat cutters' aprons and dropping guts into buckets on the floor. The facts leading up to my paternal grandfather's forced resignation were clear. 6 months earlier, the company had discovered a nearly $1.2 million embezzlement by its star controller, Ransome Josiah Thomson. The defalcation, as it was called back then, had taken place over the course of nearly a decade. Newsprint across 1,300 cities had inked the story, with the New York Times headline reading, "Report shows embezzler got $1,187,000. After the embezzlement, the value of one share of Hormel stock plummeted almost to zero, scattering the company's assets and reputation to the wind, putting at risk 1,000 employees, and cratering my grandfather's personal wealth, much of it in Hormel stock. As A.L. watched Thomson being marshaled off to jail, town gossip swirled like eddies of pork fat draining off the Hormel cutting floor. That January day, my grandfather trudged out to his Cadillac Suburban, hauling up the collar of his heavy Chicago-tailored wool topcoat against the cold. Snowdrifts felted his pant legs. Even the howling blow couldn't entirely conceal the sound of squealing pigs being prodded from outdoor pens onto the killing floor at the back of the factory. Across the Red Cedar River, A.L. pulled up the long winding driveway to his estate. Snowfall blanketed the regal white peonies he and his wife, Lena Lowenstein, had planted 3 years earlier, which lit up the month of June each summer like puffy clouds dancing over the southern Minnesota plains. The couple's second son, 17-year-old Richard, who would become my father, ever hopeful for his father's afternoon return from work, was shoveling drifts from the family's front veranda. Inside their lavish home, Lena lay dying. Whatever my grandfather said to his family about being fired that day, for it had been a resignation only in George Hormel's imagination, he penned a letter to his closest friend and business confidant, George Hastings Swift, heir to the giant Chicago meatpacking company, Swift & Company. You will probably be as much surprised as I was to know I have resigned my position, requested by Mr. Hormel on what seemed a very flimsy pretext. George Hormel's flimsy pretext and my grandfather's firing were legend in my family. My father cast them as Shakespearean tragedy, or the Horatio Alger story if Alger had lost his American dream. 6 decades after the events, my father still wept when describing his father's fall from grace and his mother's early death to cancer. Thompson's embezzlement in Austin, Minnesota, and the weight of company and family shame were traumas for my father which got taken up by me. As a kid, I was spellbound by Dad's telling of the events, but by the mid-1990s, when I was in my 40s, I was reckoning with the complicated man I knew him to be, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who surrounded himself with the best writers of the 20th century, from Robert Frost to James Dickey, a man who championed women poets and loved my mother deeply, yet had engaged in multiple affairs throughout his marriage, and had on one occasion, when I was 17, molested me in my bedroom. He was my first experience of a powerful, confusing man. He was known for telling stories that entertained his fans, but I'd learned as an adult that some of those stories were exaggerated and others simply untrue. While his tales calcified into family myth, I no longer knew whether to trust them or his tears. By all accounts, my father and his 2 siblings enjoyed an idyllic childhood in Austin, but the idyll ended that bitter January day when A.L. was called to George Hormel's office. If my father polished his stories with the elan of the literary star he would become, I was looking for a way to square them with my own lived experience. I wanted to understand my Midwestern legacy within the broad sweep of its geographic scale and our early nation-building. I never knew my paternal grandparents. Both died long before I was born. I didn't really know what to believe about Alpha LaRue Eberhart, George Hormel, or Ransome Thomson. What I knew was that throughout my early career as a management consultant, as I partnered with CEOs, mostly men back then, stories of the three men in Austin haunted me. I was working with clients to help them change their companies into places where both business and people could thrive. I watched how the CEOs operated, learned how they made decisions, took in how they told their own stories, each one of them giving me a reference point against which to think about my grandfather. If my father poetically described his father as 6 feet of manhood and not a mark of fear, few top executives I knew had no fear. If my father cast George Hormel as the villain, a bastard all greed for laying his father so low, I knew such descriptions were rarely that clean. As for the embezzler, my father both marveled at his ingenious stealing and railed at his audacity, but chose to blame him less than he did his father's former boss. In 40 years advising hundreds of powerful men, I had occasionally been in their corner suites as they considered a firing. I knew their primary reasons. Now I wanted to know how George A. Hormel and Company, a brand-name business that would become the $11 billion conglomerate it is today, got started. How the fates of these three men were sealed on the banks of the Red Cedar River. How a company nearly brought to its knees in 1921 was declared by its bankers as too big to fail, and what role any of this had to do in shaping me. 2. Company Town, Austin, Minnesota, 1995. Out the window of our compact rental car, soybean fields stretch like billowing sheets on a laundry line. My cousin, LaRue Eberhart, and I are traveling on Interstate 35 from the Minneapolis airport to Austin, 100 miles south. Blessed with a crop of thick salt-and-pepper hair and blushed cheeks, Elle is a classic beauty with the dark brows of our grandmother and the dancing eyes of our grandfather. At 60, she is 15 years my senior. That used to matter when she was 25 and I was 10, but it doesn't now. We've set aside 3 days to explore this place our fathers reminisce about, and I hope to leave with a clearer story of what happened here before either of us was born. The cerulean sky is nearly free of clouds. Wisps of fluff sail untethered. Acres fly by so fast it's hard to catch their detail. The vast open space of southern Minnesota is freeing after the charming but sometimes claustrophobic hills of New Hampshire and a hefty consulting season. A kaleidoscope of questions hangs overhead as Elle drives and I stare out the window. Why, if Austin was so pivotal to our fathers, did neither of them ever bring us here? Dad's stories tangle in my brain like lines left unfurled on a sailboat. Maybe I'm just here to clear up a few of those lines. How old was I when I was your flower girl? I ask Elle, having half forgotten the details of a favorite memory. The photograph of me at her wedding is a cherished one, she in a fitted virginal gown, me in my white-dotted Swiss beaming up at my beautiful cousin, squeezing her hand so tight I can feel the hurt. 10, Elle says, her cheeks flushed in the same pink as the bouquet of baby roses I clutched in 2 hands that day. I fill Elle in on my consulting work. In tandem with my 45th birthday, my company has just reached its 10-year mark. Friends tell me I work too much, but the long-term partnerships I've formed with CEOs as they transform their company cultures exhilarate me. I like seeing positive change happen. Eloise is a fundraiser for the American Friends Service Committee and lives in Chicago. She is sometimes called to southern Minnesota to meet with prominent donors and has been to Austin several times, where she has met people who knew or knew of our grandparents. Staring out the window, I think of the summer I got as close to Austin as I ever have until now. In 1968, I was 17, away from home for 2 months, working on a service project with Mexican-American migrant workers employed by the Owatonna Canning Company, a short jog northwest of Austin. A memory surfaces. I glance at Elle and share it with her. Seasonal employees are packed hip to hip, I tell her, like standing pickup sticks in the backs of open trucks, and driven to the fields where they will spend 12 hours harvesting asparagus and strawberries, bent over long rows in the hot sun. I'm playing outside a single-room cinder-block home at the migrant camp with Maria and her toddler sister Elena, while her older siblings and parents work in the fields. Maria is hungry and goes inside. A couple minutes later, I look through the open door and see her leaning over a gas flame, fixing a pan of something for Elena's lunch. Her cotton dress drapes too close to the flame and catches fire. The next thing I know, I'm rolling her in a blanket and the room stinks of singed cotton. Just thinking of it, I'm shaken. It was terrifying, I say to Elle. Looking back, I think it was the first time I realized my own privilege. The closest thing I know to this vast Minnesota sky is the rose-washed reach of Penobscot Bay, Maine, where my family summered. Here, I feel like Elle and I are in a massive bubble, with a sky-colored circus tent overhead, and soybeans stretching out to Earth's end. The bubble seems to contain today and every story we've heard about southern Minnesota from our fathers. But how strong is this bubble? And, knowing myself, how far will I go to find out? Elle's mission for this weekend seems to be to set the family record right about our grandfather, that he was wronged by George Hormel. We've procured an appointment with the Hormel corporate archivist because we've heard that a rumor still floats around the company and in some parts of Austin that our grandfather was complicit in Ransome J. Thomson's embezzlement. Publicly, I can't believe that's true. Privately, I don't know what to believe, but I know my family's stories are rarely uncomplicated. It's not right what the company did, Elle says after we pass a sign indicating that we're more than halfway to Austin. Our grandfather was a good man, a family man, and he built that company. That's what we've heard, I say. I never knew Dad to hate anyone, but he hated George Hormel. A.L. and George were friends. George's wife Lillian and grandmother Lena were too. And Hormel fired A.L. while Lena was dying. I shake my head. I don't know how our grandfather got through that year. Elle sighs. Me either. The lush, weed-free miles of soybeans lull me. I hope I'm open to learning whatever I need to learn about my grandfather. I'm not here to prove his innocence. I've only started to look through the 4 large boxes of his letters and business documents held within my father's literary archives at Dartmouth College. I don't know what to believe, but I want to test a few nascent speculations while I'm here. Like it or not, and sometimes I don't. I've always wanted to know the truth about everything. A new entrepreneur client once told me that trait might get me in trouble in the short run, but was the only way to live. The CEOs with whom I consult want the truth I see inside their companies. It's only when they're grounded in reality that they can make their best decisions. If family lore holds that A.L. was devastatingly wronged by his boss, did my grandfather own any part of it? If George Hormel was a bastard, as my father said, might he have been anything more? Maybe my grandfather was neither the saint my father described nor the sinner George Hormel fired. A falcon glides east across the highway, makes a hard north turn, and traces his beady eyes to the ground, scouting for dinner. What was my grandfather scouting for in 1901 when he accepted George Hormel's invitation to Austin? What could the young Hormel, a novice entrepreneur, have offered that was attractive enough to lure A.L. from a good job with an already giant meatpacking company in Chicago, a city known as the meat capital of the world? By 1901, A.L. was heading up Swift & Company's sales offices in St. Paul. Newly married and known in the industry, he had a bright future ahead of him. St. Paul was a bustling city of 160,000 people with concrete sidewalks, broad streets, and trolley cars. Austin was a town of 5,000 with a muddy main street littered with 15 saloons and 3 billiard halls. The highway spills out ahead of us, splitting 60 miles of soybeans like the Red Cedar River splits the east and west sides of Austin. Ever since George Hormel opened his first meat market in 1898, Austin has been a company town. Now the Hormel Company is ranked among the 10 largest meat packers in the country and is no longer run by family members. Under corporate leadership, it has reconstructed its brand, in part by accenting the second syllable of the family name instead of the first. Those we'll meet in Austin will still claim the family's pronunciation of Hormel. At first, this sounds odd to my ear, an indication that the newly accentuated Hormel has taken root, at least beyond Minnesota. This weekend, Elle and I will discover that the company's smoked meats infuse nearly every block we will walk in Austin. Its history will show on the faces of most citizens we encounter. Its brand plumps the bellies of white mid-level executives who fill city restaurants from noon to 1 o'clock. Its name or its money is associated with the high school auditorium, the 4,000-seat high school football stadium, the nature center, the golf course, the library. Riverland Community College fills its classes with hopeful 18-year-olds ready to work for the company in entry-level positions. There wouldn't be much to Austin, Minnesota without George A. Hormel and Company, which makes the company both powerful and incapable of hiding. At some point, the soybeans outside our car turn into oats, and millions of seed heads bob like the ends of upside-down brooms. If I squint just right, I can turn those oats into the fur underbelly of a hog. Squint and release. Squint and release. I lock this image in place, where endless feed crops surround a town whose name is synonymous with bacon. It's beautiful here, I say. This big sky, these endless waves of grain. The cliché feels right. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, Elle sings in her perfect soprano, her patriotism contagious. There's a lot of amber grain here to admire. So different from the shrimpy farming valleys of New England, I say, laughing. A family farm in New Hampshire would be a backyard 4-H project here. We can't hold a candle. Elle and I tally a list of questions for the weekend. We line up the first 2 men in our sights. George Albert Hormel, with his stolid Germanic frame, his 5-pound meat cleaver hanging from his butcher's belt. Alpha LaRue Eberhart, with his perfect posture and patrician nose, his sizzling eyes, his show tunes piano playing that charmed Lena Lowenstein of Whitehall, Illinois, into marrying and following him to downtown Chicago, to St. Paul, and finally to Austin. You know, we could have been rich, I say, leaning into Elle. Really rich. I figured it out from the financial records in Dad's archives. If A.L. had been able to hang on to his Hormel stock, we'd be filthy rich, just like George Hormel's grandchildren. But money. Elle smiles, she the frugal wife of a minister. It might have corrupted us. I could stand a little corruption right now, I think to myself. My divorce 5 years ago, my 2 children headed to college, my growing consulting company. Money flowing in is just about matching money flowing out. I don't know what I feel about the level of wealth we might have inherited. but my curiosity here has never been about the lost money, even if the specter of it is seductive. Really, it is about these three protagonists who've occupied my family's stage. I feel a need to inhabit them, to try to understand who they were, what they did, and why, to the extent that's even possible. I want to claim the grandfather and grandmother I never knew. I want to tell their story as I figure out mine. Elle signals our exit from the highway. You read the directions, Gretch. She hands me a printed email from Betty Catherwood, the woman whose house we're looking for. A few commercial outfits sprinkle the edge of the highway exit. Then there's just a flat grid of unremarkable neighborhoods, one after another, as we head into town. We could be anywhere in Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Middle America. In 1995, this small city of 20,000 doesn't offer much of a first impression. 3. He could cleave a hog with a single blow. Austin, Minnesota, 1995 and 1900. Betty Catherwood uncorks a bottle of dry sherry and places a platter of mini hot dog buns stuffed with something mayonnaise-y between Elle and me. We're tired from traveling, but eager to be with Betty, whose husband Roger died last year. Rog Catherwood was our father's best friend growing up in Austin. See what you think of these, Betty says, offering her platter. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. I thought we'd start with Spam, she says. Spam! Elle's laugh trills through the room like her song. The mention of Spam is enough to wake me from jet lag. Hormel's best-known product, created after A.L. left the company, made famous for feeding soldiers during World War II, then infamous by Monty Python. My mother made Spam sandwiches on island picnics in Maine. She called it the perfect American food, a mashup of whatever bits and pieces had no other home. Like our nation, she'd laugh, with its tired and poor. The little sandwiches are dressed up with mayonnaise, chopped pickles, scallion, and celery, then dusted with paprika. And I admit they are tasty. Betty is a tidy, small, robust woman of 75 years, whose thinning hair is colored and permed. Her pressed blue seersucker clothes offset her comfortable-looking beige walking shoes. A graduate of Wayne State University and an art teacher throughout her life, she is, according to Elle, open-minded, so I assume she won't mind my questions, even though she's related to the Hormel family by marriage. Roger's father, Samuel Doak Catherwood, was George Hormel's best friend and long-term legal counsel, also a good friend of A.L. George's sole son, J. Hormel, carried Catherwood as his middle name. The Catherwoods, Hormels, and Eberharts occupied privileged space in Austin. Betty says she wants to know what we're learning while we're learning it. I found a journal of my father's from 1919, I say, 2 years before the embezzlement made national headlines. He and Rog hiked up the Cedar River to camp out. Oh, I'm eager to hear. Betty's eyes are lit with memories of her husband. I recount what I've read of Dad's journal, that he and Rog were working in the packing plant that summer and had just earned $12 and change for 2 weeks' wages. I use air quotes when I retell from my father's journal that they'd been stuffing George Hormel's sausages. This gets a laugh from Elle and Betty. Dad and Rog were excited for an adventure, for the freedom of finding a campsite near Ramsey that they'd made the summer before. Was Dryden on that trip? Elle asks, referring to her father. Just Rog and Dad, I say. 2 boys, free of their parents and their boss. But the river sounds like it was really shallow. Is that true? I ask Betty. Oh, yes, she says. It's never been much of a river. Sometimes you can walk across it, except when it floods, and then it's quite dangerous. I think Rog was 17, Dad 15. They'd signed a pact to try to find an old haunted house in Ramsey in the dead of the night, I say with air quotes again. I've been steeped in Dad's journals and letters recently, doing research for my first book. Ramsey is 5 miles north of Austin, Betty tells us. She reminds me that she knows my father because he and Raj
Sample complete. Ready to continue?